Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle, a solutions-focused podcast about the economic challenges facing the Canadian middle class. I'm your host, Cara. I'm a journalist with 15 years experience and both a personal and professional interest in all things housing.
And I'm your host, Mike Moffatt. Some of you might recognize me from the social network formerly known as Twitter. I'm also a housing, innovation, trade, and regulatory expert and the founding director of the Place Center, a think tank devoted to growing local economies in an environmentally sustainable way.
It wasn't that long ago that a single person working a middle-class job, say a teacher, a contractor, a journalist, making the median salary, could afford to house and feed a family. In big cities like Toronto, they may have had a small house, but they could drive a few minutes outside the city and get themselves a family-sized suburban home. That was just normal. Mike, you're from London, Ontario. What was it like buying your first home?
Okay, so picture it. London, Ontario, 2004. My partner and I were both grad students at Western, and we were making a little bit of money, but not particularly wealthy. And we wanted to get our first home, so we saved up a bit of money and got some support from our parents as well. And we put down a $30,000 down payment on a home that cost $168,000. And this was a brand new home, 3 bedrooms with a yard about 7 kilometers north of Western. So I could bike there. I even walked to the office every so often. And at the time, like $30,000 for a down payment just seemed like an impossible amount of money. But it was that $168,000 for a home. Back then there was this kind of rule that people had of don't spend more than 3 times your combined income on a home. And we were, if we combined our incomes, that the $168,000 was probably what we made in about 2.5 years. So it was still within that limit. Over time, we made upgrades to that home. We finished the basement. We put in a deck. Probably an extra $25,000 worth of stuff. So it's about $190,000 altogether, and we made it work. Fast forward to 2012, and we sold that home for about $250,000. So an extra $50,000, but compounded over 8 years. That was just basically like a 3% price increase, which to my mind seems reasonable. Seems like how the housing market should work, that prices can go up, kind of in line with inflation and wages and that kind of thing. Fast forward 10 years later, that same home, if you want to buy that home in that neighborhood in London, Ontario, it costs about $750,000. So what that means now, if we use that 3x salary, you need to have a couple who's earning $250,000 a year combined to afford this 3-bedroom home. So things have changed a lot. So Gen Xers like me who bought homes in the early 2000s in cities like London, we were able to afford it. Again, it seemed a little bit difficult at the time, but we made it work. Nowadays, I don't know many couples in London who are earning $250,000 in their first or second job. So Cara, what was it like for you?
I just bought my home this year. I started looking a few years ago, the year before the pandemic. At that time, it was so disheartening because I was looking at what home prices were. Our budget at the time was about $650,000. I didn't have student debt. So I started saving very early on and started investing early on, and so did my husband. And so we started looking, and it became it was daunting. There was nothing in that budget. It wasn't going to happen looking for something that we could stay in for more than a couple of years. Everyone always told me you need to be able to stay there for something like 6 years to break even. So don't buy a place unless you're planning to stay there for at least that time. Then the pandemic happened. So I was kind of grateful it didn't work out because my husband's a travel agent. So that didn't go, his job wasn't great at that time. But we continued to save. And then fast forward to this year where we bought a home. And I mean, hearing your numbers, just our down payment was $325,000. And our home was, we paid $930,000. And I mean, I keep thinking I never would have imagined having to pay that much. It's a 2-bedroom home. It is in a great neighborhood, in my opinion. It was not a traditionally great neighborhood. I love it. It's in the Danforth East End of Toronto, and traditionally that should have been a working class neighborhood. the homes I saw that this one went for less than half of that 10 years ago. It just like it's mind-boggling when I hear those numbers. And I just what got me into housing and thinking about these things is when I started looking, and when I started thinking, my husband and I make together, it's about double the median household income in Toronto, which is around 84,000. That's the median household income in Toronto. And so we make double that, and we felt like we were struggling and we needed family help, just like anyone else getting into the housing market. I always make sure to tell people, anyone getting into the housing market at this point had family help. There's just no other way. And so when I think about that, if we're struggling, like, how are other people doing it? How do you do it if you can't save that kind of money and if your rent is so much higher?
Well, I don't think they are doing it. And I again, look, even fast forward to 2012 when that home was $250,000 in London. I feel like I'm saying, like, oh, back when I took the TTC, it cost a quarter. Like, I just feel absolutely ancient. And this was, 10 years ago. And what we're seeing is families basically not making a go of it, particularly in a city like Toronto. So there's this concept in real estate called drive until you qualify. And the idea is that you've got a couple, they might be living in an apartment somewhere and they need a little bit more space. Baby comes along or baby's on the way. And they go, okay, you know what? Our budget for a home is $650,000, and that's not going to get you anything in Toronto. So basically, what they have to do is they jump in the car and they drive as far away as they need to go in order to find the places where the homes start costing $650,000 or $700,000 or whatever their budget is. And now, to do that, and because we had so many families do that caused prices all across southern Ontario to kind of go up as well. And that's part of what we saw happen in London. So overall, you're seeing people having to move very far away in order to find homes they can afford because they just can't make a go of it in Toronto.
And that's kind of what we want to help you understand through this podcast. We're not going to talk just about housing. It's really about the erosion of the middle class, but housing's really a great place to start because I always think if you can't afford shelter, like, nothing else matters.
Yeah, that's just it. That's job number one. You need to be able to house people, and if you can't, then they're not going to stick around. And that's not just an issue for those couples because you say, okay, well, Mike or Cara or whoever can't afford to live here. Well, that's their problem. Well, the issue becomes that the people who are moving, it's a lot of teachers and nurses and people with good middle class jobs that move out. So you can say, okay, well, too bad for the nurses that they have to leave Toronto, which is fine until you live in Toronto and you actually need a nurse or you need a teacher or you need a personal support worker and they can't afford to live here. So what happens at the individual level happens at the macro level. And we're seeing this disappearance of the young middle class in cities like Toronto and increasingly in cities like London as well.
People have always had to move in order to afford a home. We always heard about, as you talked about, the drive till you qualify. And nowadays that still is happening, and people can do remote work. So I hear from people, it's easier in some ways because you don't have to drive in every day. Haven't cities and suburbs and the places around the most desirable neighborhoods, haven't they always been somewhat expensive? Haven't cities in particular always been expensive?
Yeah, so it's funny that this is both kind of similar to things that have happened in the past and different. So where it's similar is absolutely that there are neighborhoods in cities like Toronto that have essentially priced out the middle class. That part isn't new, and the part where you've got an individual or a couple living in apartments, in downtown Toronto, and then going, oh, we need a little bit more space to raise kids, so they have to move somewhere else. None of that's new. But if we go to look at say the 1970 or 1982, where those couples were moving were places like Etobicoke, right, or they were moving to Scarborough or somewhere like that, where they could still commute into their job. They could, back then it might have been a 10 or 15 minute drive, or they could take the bus or that kind of thing. Fast forward to the 1980s and they're probably moving out to Mississauga. A little bit further away, a little bit longer commute, but you still make that work. What's changed is in the last 10 years or so, where they're moving to is, again, a place like a Woodstock, a London. Maybe they're going the other direction. They're going to Peterborough or Belleville, or they're going closer to Owen Sound. At that point, you're out of commuting distance, or at least out of reasonable commuting distance. So you're having people who, have to drive an hour or two each way, or if we had better train service in the country, you could do that, but unfortunately you can't. So you have people taking long commutes. Certainly work from home helps, and work from home is often seen as sort of a panacea to this. It's like, well, you could still work in Toronto but now live in London, which is absolutely true. But what essentially that's caused is that those high housing prices in Toronto are now getting transmitted to the rest of the country. And we saw this during the pandemic, where a lot of young families said, you know what, I'm going to move out to like rural New Brunswick because maybe I've got family out there and I got more space. And then overnight, all of these kind of secondary and tertiary markets that home prices were like doubling in like 18 months because everybody had that same idea. So yes, work from home has increased mobility and taken some of the pressure off, but it hasn't actually relieved the pressure. It's just transmitted that pressure from Toronto to a Kitchener, Waterloo, a London, a Windsor, or where have you.
When you bought your home, you got some family help too, right?
Yeah, we got a little bit of family help, and we were grateful for it. But again, between the help that we got from my parents, the help that we got from Hannah's parents, and the money that we had saved ourselves, all in, that was $30,000. $30,000 as a down payment is not going to get you anything anymore. So now what we're kind of asking of parents is far more help. And what this is causing is this kind of two-speed type process where you've got people who have parents who can help out in a significant way. They're able to get the homes. And if you've got parents who can't, you're on your own. And this is, back again, 2004. Had we been forced to, we could have saved that $30,000. It would have been harder, but we would have been able to do it. If we were doing that today, 20 years later, it would just never happen. Like we would still be living in a one-bedroom apartment somewhere, and probably would have never had kids.
And those apartments are so much more expensive now. I think about this a lot, how I started in my job, 10 years ago, that my day job, and at that time, I lived on my own. I had a one-bedroom apartment, and I could afford it on my own. When I put in my application, the people were like, "Oh yeah, you're going to be accepted. Don't worry about it. You're fine." And now, like, the same income cannot get that apartment. That apartment's gone up. It's about doubled since then, and that was only in 2015 that I had my one-bedroom apartment. And so I think about all the money that I was able to save. If I was living there now, it'd be impossible. Like, there's just no way.
Yeah, and that's the big challenge as well. So it's not only that young people have to make bigger down payments, but it's also harder for them to save because rents are so high. So that's more of their money going out of their pocket. So they're getting squeezed or getting hit both ways, where they're having to save more, but their ability to save has been reduced. Again, as apartments in Toronto, London, I think new leases are up about 85% over the last 4 years. So essentially have doubled. Rents have essentially doubled in the city, in the last 50 months or so. So that's a huge issue, right? Where these couples and individuals are just completely unable to break into the market.
What I hear a lot from people is that it's always been this difficult. They had to save up so much money. They had to, live in their basement and rent out the upstairs. People had to make sacrifices. They didn't buy their forever home on their first home. I'll keep pointing out to them, they bought their first home much younger. They didn't buy the home when they needed the biggest size home that they will need in their life when they have kids, typically. But I don't hear any sort of, there's a lot of people who don't understand how difficult it is, that the same circumstances that you had then, all the hard work you put in, all the sacrifices you made, wouldn't get you there today. Like, how do you convince people that it is different?
Yeah, it is a challenge. You don't want to downplay what they went through, and that's always my tendency, right? I'd be like, oh, come on, guys, because one of the things I'll get a lot is like, well, back in 1981, interest rates were 21%. Like, yeah, but your entire house cost $70,000, right? Like 21% of $70,000 is about, $14,000 a year. We pay far more than that, so like 6% of a really big number is a lot more than 21% of a smaller number. So absolutely there's been challenges before, but I think, what I'd say is look at the aggregate data. Look at what's happened to home ownership rates of people between, say, the ages of 30 and 34. They have declined substantially. And it's not because young people are picky. It's not because young people have just decided, you know what, I never want to own a home, and I'm just happy being where I am. And I know young people certainly aren't happy with having to have rents that are like triple what they were 10 years ago. So, I don't buy it. There's nothing in the data that suggests that all that has changed is preferences, and that young people have it so much easier, or it's nothing's really changed in the last 4 years. Things have fundamentally changed. Young people own homes at much lower rates than they used to, and when they're moving much farther than they used to. Those are facts. Those are indisputable facts. And I don't think it's preferences. I don't think millennials just woke up one day and said, you know what, Toronto's nice, but I'd much rather live in Woodstock. And Woodstock's lovely too. I have nothing against Woodstock. My sister lives there. But this is not some fad or some trend. It's economic circumstance.
One thing I want to put on the table there is that I know StatsCan numbers showing home ownership of millennials. It's actually very similar to boomers at that age. In terms of home ownership rates, obviously the thing that I keep thinking about is different, because people point that number to me and say it's actually not that much less. Is that what are they owning? How many bedrooms are in the place that they're owning? So if you have someone owning a 1-bedroom condo, that's not equivalent to someone owning a family-sized home, which is what the boomers would have had at that same age. There's a bit of a divide I see among my friends where I'm peak millennial age, and it seems like the people who are a little bit older than me, if they bought a home earlier, they're fine. Like, a lot of them bought condos, and then that went up in value, and so they're doing much better. There's like a real divide in millennials of people who bought in early and people who are totally screwed. And what I see is it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And what you said earlier about how it comes down to, like, did your parents buy a home? If your family wasn't in a position to buy a home, or at the time it wasn't seen as the number one way to build wealth, it was just I was always told, don't count on your home for your retirement. I've heard that was something that was told to older generations, is that is not your retirement plan. So then if your parents didn't buy a home for whatever reason, circumstances, anything, are you just screwed?
Yeah, I would say so. That it's hard that if you've got all of your money going to rent, you're not putting it in a house, but you're also not able to put that money in a TFSA or RRSP or other savings vehicles. And when we look at the sort of differences between boomers and millennials and home ownership, like, first of all, it is down, but secondly, you need to do an apples to apples comparison, right? Where you need to compare Toronto in 1981 or whatever your year is to Toronto in 2021. I would argue that there is a fundamental difference between being able to own a home in a city where the jobs are and owning a home and you're having to commute an hour and a half. So I think it's really important for us to do apples to apples comparisons, because I hear this data too, but I'm like, okay, but what have you controlled for, right? And you mentioned house size, which is a huge one. I think we need to control for commuting distance. So there are these fundamental differences, I believe.
I have a question. I just want to interject here for a second. So we've now established, basically through the conversation, that there's a fundamental difference, and that millennials are getting the short end of the stick. And I would argue that the closer you are to being a boomer, the more wealth you have. And I'm wondering, is this just a timing issue? Like, the fact that I'm personally a Gen X, my siblings are older than me. My sister's 11 years older than me. She bought her house in Toronto in 1989, which was a terrible year to buy a house. It was around $230,000, and her down payment was approximately $30,000, her entire down payment, and she sold it a few years later for the exact same price that she paid for it. That generation is scarred from that experience, and I do think it has a bigger impact on them. It kind of sticks in their memory in such a way as it might taint their forward vision. But almost every generation or person I know who was closer to being boomer than a Gen X is doing financially better. And then also the older millennials are doing better than the younger millennials. Like, is this just a weird timing issue?
No, I don't think it is. And I think it's important to, and this is where the apples to apples comparison is important, that I don't think you shouldn't compare a 55-year-old today to a 45-year-old today or a 35-year-old today. Because there's, effects as you get older. Like your income rises, your savings rises. So it's not that today's 35-year-olds are doing better or worse than today's 55-year-olds, because you would expect, there's this kind of lifetime income thing that happens, that over time you get wealthier and then you retire and you draw down on those savings. The issue is more that today's 35-year-olds are doing worse than 35-year-olds 20 years ago. I think that's where you need to get those apples to apples comparison. And you're right, there is sort of a scarring effect. But if I went to my students at Ivy who are 23 years old and say, look, I could wave a magic wand and make home prices $230,000 a year, but the catch is those prices won't go up in 10 years. 10 years later, they'll still be what they are now. They're not going to see that as a bad scenario. They're not going to see that as a worst case scenario. They're like, oh my God, sign me up. That sounds freaking amazing. So I think that's what's changed, that our worst case scenarios, and that was a real issue. My parents bought a home in February 1988, and I remember the same thing, that basically stayed flat for about 15 years. So that was a real thing that happened, and that was not great for those individuals. Our challenge is now that our worst case scenarios have gotten a whole lot worse.
When did it become an idea that your house should go up and that would be like, that's your investment, you're investing in your home? Was that the message you got when you were buying your first home?
Yeah, it essentially was. Or it was more that, like, oh, if you pay rent, that's money that you'll never see again. But if you buy a home, every time you make a mortgage payment, that's essentially like a form of forced savings. And there is something to that, right? That you can use it as a savings vehicle. It's not a great one necessarily from a portfolio point of view, because what that would have meant for me and my family is like, okay, like 80% of my wealth is tied up in London, Ontario real estate. That's not a very balanced portfolio, right? You want to have some money in real estate and some in stocks and bonds.
It's impossible now. Like,
you can't do that anymore. We can't do that anymore. But the challenge is that you go, okay, well, maybe the answer is not everybody should own. Maybe more people should rent, which is fine, except rents are through the ceiling, right? So if that's where we want to go in society, we say, you know what, home ownership is overrated. We want more people to rent. Well, the rent is too damn high. We just can't, that's just not possible. So I don't think it's necessarily fair. And I'm not suggesting that you guys were, and this was Meredith who chimed in earlier. I forgot to introduce her, our producer. I'm not suggesting you guys were saying that, but if the message that we want to get across is that we need more people renting and fewer people owning, we got to make rents a whole lot more affordable to make that an attractive option.
So it sounds like we're pivoting towards like the solution part of the podcast, and I wanted the audience to know that we are going to go deep into solutions, but we're not going to be able to tackle it all in the first episode. This was an idea to just kind of whet your appetite and introduce you to the people who are doing it. I do have one question that I want to ask that I'm hoping will be somewhere near the end of the episode, which is, where's the revolution? Because people have been shafted. Those people are our youngest generation, and they are the future of Canada and Ontario. And it does very much feel like the economy, or at least housing, has been structured to disadvantage them. Not consciously, just over time, slowly, incrementally over time. Do either of you have any insight as to why this hasn't become a bigger political issue?
I think it's so complicated that I don't know how you, like, if you have a protest, generally you'd want to have like, this is what we're looking for, this is the outcome, and I don't think anyone really knows like what's the one outcome that could happen. We're seeing, like, I see people focus on certain aspects of it, but there's not really one thing that it's not even one government you can target where we can say this is what we want to change. It's kind of, we want the whole system to change. That's really what it comes down to, and that's like too big of an ask for most people.
Yeah, I think that's just it. That it's a complicated issue. You've got 3 different orders of government, 4 if you live in like Peel region and York region, you have regional government. So it's not even clear who's causing the problem. It's not totally clear to people what order of government should be solving it, or maybe it's the private sector builders and developers or whoever. But I think there is a generalized anger about the issue, and I think we are actually seeing that manifest itself. Like you look at the way Pierre Poilievre talks about this issue federally. He's not providing solutions, and he's getting a lot of sort of criticism for that, rightfully so. But I think he's tapped into the idea that I don't think people are actually looking for solutions. I think people are looking for an outlet for their anger. So I actually think we are seeing it, and I think it's probably not. It's understandable, but I don't think it's particularly helpful for our policy making or political discourse. But I do think in some real way that revolution is starting.
That's it for today's episode. If you have any questions or feedback for us, we'd love to hear from you. What do you think are the biggest challenges facing Canada's middle class?
You can find our host, Cara and me, Mike Moffatt, and our producer, Meredith Martin, on all the social media channels.